Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on equitable and inclusive library policies. My name is Joy Worland, and I'm a consultant at the State Library here in Vermont, the Vermont Department of Libraries. My role is consultant for continuing education and small and rural libraries. So I'm very happy that you are all here and joining us for this very important aspect. Jason actually touched on some things that relate a lot to what we're going to talk about today in terms of the library really truly being a welcoming and inclusive place. So thinking about why we're here today, why is it important to think about inclusive policies and to examine our policies that we have to see if they really are inclusive, because sometimes they seem like they are, but they may actually not be as much as we think when we think about how they're affecting certain populations or certain members of our communities. So we're going to look at some common policies, some pitfalls of ones that you might not have thought about having pitfalls, and just talk about different ways that we can make improvements in some of them. So I wanted to read from the ALA policy guidelines regarding what the characteristics that policies should have. Publicly supported libraries governing authorities may place reasonable and narrowly drawn restrictions on the time, place, or manner of access to library resources, services, or facilities, provided that such restrictions are content neutral and are not based upon arbitrary distinctions between individuals or classes of individuals. Some examples of such distinctions would be restricting access based on citizenship or immigration status, restricting access for minors to resources routinely provided to adults, restricting access based on financial means or housing status, or restricting access based on partisan or doctrinal disapproval of the user's views or of the information the user seeks. So those last things are areas where it is not okay to make restrictions on them. So, there are certain things that you as trustees have the authority to make policies and decisions about, certain things when the library is going to be open and that sort of thing. But if it comes down to restricting access to a certain population, then that is not great. So another aspect, not just what the policies are, but to consider how are the policies implemented? Are they implemented in an equitable way? Are they fair? Are they always done with the consistently depending on who you're dealing with in your library? So looking again at thinking about when you create a policy, who is going to be affected by it? How are they going to be affected by it? How are different people going to be affected by it in different ways? And trying to make that fair and consistent and truly inclusive. So I would love for just to take a couple of minutes here to, if people can just write in the chat if they're comfortable doing that, share something about your library that you make that you feel makes it feel like a very welcoming place. So what it could be a policy, it could be just the way the mood of the library is, and I'm talking about when it's open, not right now, but in before the pandemic hit, and looking forward to when libraries will be open in a more traditional way, which we know they will be at some point. But what is it that makes your library a welcoming place for people in your community? Just a few words in the chat. We'll just pause here for a second so people can write and then we can look at them.
Joy, do you want to give a quick option for folks who are on the phone to
yes,
chime in
briefly?
You.
Yes, thank you, Josh, for that reminder. And people on the phone, since you can't chat, if you want to unmute, press *6, and you can just verbally share something quickly with us if you'd like. So not a lot of takers yet. So I'm just looking for something that characterizes your library, sort of the warm fuzzy of your library, in a couple of words. I know you all have them because you're trustees and you love your libraries. Okay, so we don't need to linger on this. You can continue to do it throughout and we can reference this back. But what I was trying to get at was a mood of, sort of how we think of libraries as library lovers, as library ambassadors when we're staff and trustees, and you put in all this time and volunteer, time for it. So we have this perception of libraries, and it's an accurate one, of being very welcoming. But again, the sort of purpose of this session is to unpack when we might think we're being more welcoming and inclusive than we actually are, or when we're doing that in a way that's not open to everybody in our community. So I just was thinking of examples of when we might think that a policy is a good one and a pitfall that it might have. I just have a couple of examples for that. And one of them is there are a lot of libraries that have a policy against sleeping in the library. And this tends to be, it's certainly very popular in urban settings where there's sometimes tension between library staff and people who might be experiencing homelessness or don't have places to go. But it happens, you know, in Vermont, there are libraries that have that policy. And just thinking about, if you have a policy like that, how are you going to enforce that? And a personal example would be, I have trouble staying awake during any sort of movie. So if I were at a movie program at a library, I've never actually fallen asleep during a library program, but it certainly could happen based on my activity at home. My family would tell you how much that happens every time a movie goes on. So think about, would I be treated the same way as someone who's experiencing homelessness? And my guess is probably not. I think that that kind of policy would not be applied to a middle-aged woman who gets sleepy at night when there's a movie on. However, it would be possibly applied to someone in a different way, in a way that would not make them feel welcoming, like it was okay for them to be in the library space if it were somebody sleeping in the chair in the middle of the day because they had nowhere else to go that was warm and a soft place to stay. So just, I mean, that's one example. And another example that unfortunately is a real life example of somebody that I know. We think about behavioral policies and the how much sound, how much noise people can make in a library, how loud their voice can be. And there was an example of one of my colleagues, actually a librarian, and she has an autistic son. She was at the library, not working, but as a patron, and her son was chastised for speaking too loudly, and he doesn't have complete control over how loudly he speaks. And so that was a way that a library policy was enforced in a way that made her, as an advocate for her son, but also as a professional in this field, angry. It made her not want to go to that particular library branch again. And it made her also, since she is in the field, want to educate people about it. And that's part of the reason I know this story, is because it was, you know, a teachable moment for her about how staff needs to be trained and how policies need to be developed in a way that prevents situations like that from happening. So there are a lot of library policies that can sort of be seen in this lens. Some of the ones we're going to look at today are these. Just briefly touch on them. And there are others as well. We won't probably get to all of these today, but I wanted to start with the requirements to get a library card, because that is a pretty significant one. The barriers that come up with that. What kind of ID is required to get a library card? What kind of, does somebody have to have a proof of permanent address? Some people don't have a proof of a permanent address. And what happens if they don't have that? Could they use the address of a shelter? Could they use an address if they're staying at a friend's house and just sleeping on their couch because they're in between homes at some point? We've been doing some work with the Vermont Migrant Farm Worker Education Department from UVM Extension. We're going to do some training with them. And one of the things that they brought up was people who are possibly undocumented, or even if they might present in a way that people would think they might be undocumented, they don't want to come into what they see as a public, municipal, maybe governmental kind of an institution like a library and necessarily show their paperwork. So what about those people? And if you have rules like that, you're missing out on populations that could really benefit from a lot of the services that libraries have to offer. And we are really required to share our services with everyone, because we're, as public libraries, are tax supported. So, and what about some of the other questions that are sometimes on library applications? Does your application ask what gender the person is? And if so, do you really need to know that? And are there, what number of options do you have for that? Is it just binary, or are there other options, or does someone have an option of saying what their preferred pronouns are? And then in that case, also just think about, like, why do we need that information? And if there's a danger of making anybody uncomfortable with it, maybe we just don't need to be asking that. Applications in languages other than English, that doesn't come up a lot in Vermont, but it does sometimes. And just having examples of what you like, knowing who to ask if you need one in Spanish or French or any other language. Just, you certainly don't need to have on file, multiple copies of applications in languages that you hardly ever encounter, but just to give some thought to that and have a plan for if that does happen, so that it isn't just somebody trying to struggle with filling out something in a language that they don't know. Also, a lot of libraries have been doing this during the pandemic, finding ways for people to sign up for library cards without coming to the building in the case of the pandemic. But this is something that you might want to consider carrying forward, because there are some people who can't physically get to the library. So is there a way either that library staff can go off-site and offer library card services, or do it over the phone or online, have an online service? So those are just things to think about. And I want to, I hope this technology will work. I have an example. The Berkeley Public Library in California has some really interesting library card options. So if I hopefully can pull that up. Can someone tell me if they see that? Josh, do you see the library website?
Yep. Yes, it is up and running.
Okay, thank you. So here's the different kinds of cards they have. The one that I really wanted to identify or point out is this easy access card right here. It's available to all California residents who have picture ID, but cannot currently provide address verification. So that's somebody with, one of the examples was like somebody could use a Costco card if they had it. They could have anything with a picture ID, but they don't have to have a home address. They don't have to have a piece of mail that's showing that they're paying bills. And they can access library internet computers, in-house laptops, all the online services, and checking out 3 physical items, which is interesting, because some libraries have an opportunity like this and they can only use electronic things. But if you think about that, like if you are lending out electronic digital materials, there's no way that they can keep them and not give them back. So you don't really need a physical address for anybody that's borrowing that. So I wanted to point that out, and then also use this website as a segue into another hot topic, which is loan periods and fines or lack of fines. I mean, I'm not going to spend too much on this because there's been a lot of attention paid to this already, just in Vermont and also nationally. But I do want to point out that a library that's, a large urban library like this does not have fines for books, for audio books, for DVDs. And they also have a pretty long checkout period, 3 weeks, and then automatic renewals. So right there with automatic renewals, you're not even going to have as many overdue materials. And that is actually an equity issue. So particularly the fine part where there's money involved, but also if depending on people's circumstances, it might be hard for them to get into the library and return their books, or get into and ask for a renewal, or go online and renew their books. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the fine issue, because I think it's changing. There are certainly libraries within Vermont that are considering it more and more. But one thing I hear a lot in Vermont is that having no fines is fine for the small libraries, but doesn't work for the large libraries, which it definitely is a different consideration. If you're getting a big chunk of, some libraries get thousands of dollars from fines. So you have to really, really rethink your budget. But I wanted to point out that it isn't just small libraries that do this. There's some Berkeley, and some other examples, San Francisco, Denver, Nashville, Baltimore, all of these large library systems have gotten rid of fines and just worked to have the budget issues, worked out their budget in a different way, so they're not relying on those thousands of dollars worth of fines. And so I just want to make a pitch for at least considering that. And I know that there are some libraries that went fine-free during the pandemic and are considering like whether or not to keep that going. So just think about that. In your resources, there's going to be a resource list on our website and to share at the end here. There's actually a map that shows different libraries throughout the country that have gone fine-free, and it's pretty impressive. There's a lot of libraries on there all over in different kinds of situations, different size communities. So there's another factor. I'm going to take the Berkeley site off. Hopefully go back to my slides here. So moving back to, or moving on to another area of policy, one thing I want to talk about is the hours of your library. So think about different populations that would be using your library. Are your hours such that you're meeting the needs of diverse populations within your community? So are you open on the weekends? Are you open sometimes in the evening? If you have children's programs, are they always in the morning on a weekday? And if so, what about people who are working during that time? So then they can't bring their children to that. So just think about that and think about when do programs happen? Are they always at a time that people have to be available early evening? Are they always, or do you have them in the morning? And then in which case you're getting people either that are not employed or self-employed or retired. And just so think about mixing those things up so that you're meeting a lot of different people. And then thinking about computer use. So what are your requirements? Do people have to have a library card to use computers at your library? And if so, what about those people we talked about earlier that may not be able to get a library card because they don't have a permanent address or the proper kind of ID that you want? So most libraries have some sort of guest pass. And if you don't I think you should consider having a guest pass, but then also think about what do people need to use the guest pass? Do they need to show ID for that? And so just think about that so that everybody in your community can use those public computers. And then also the policies around how long can people use the computers. There are sometimes that people come in and they're filling out governmental forms, they're making a job application, they're building their resume. If you have very strict rules about how long someone can be on a computer, it's very hard to do some of those kind of things. And those are the people that really need those computers the most because they may not have the access to do it at home. What about thinking about fees for printing? If there are certain things that they can't get anywhere else at this point, like if they really need a printed tax form, for example, the library's a place where they can access it online and then print it. Think about whether that's fair and the correct thing to do if you charge them for that. Because again, there are people that need that service at the library. They need it at the library because they can't get it anywhere else. And again, thinking about enforcing things consistently, even with going back to thinking about fines, and sometimes library staff will sort of on the fly, we go, I know this person, I know they're going to bring it back tomorrow, I just waive the fine, that kind of thing happens. And just be careful about making sure that you're fair and consistent with all that, and that you're that the staff has guidelines for that too. So that's where the policy issue comes in, so they're not trying to just figure out on their own. Thinking about collection development and the policy for that, and is there anything actually written in the policy about trying to have a diverse collection? Is there a commitment to buying books from BIPOC authors and publishers as well? There's been a lot more attention paid to publishers in the last few months around that issue, not just authors, but like supporting BIPOC-owned businesses and publishers, and you're going to get different voices out of those publishers. So consider actually having something specific, like intentional, in your collection development policy, so it isn't just left to the librarian making choices, but and hoping that they're well trained in doing that in a good way. Is there anything in the collection development policy stating that you'll have different viewpoints on current issues or historical issues, or is again that just dependent on the person who happens to be doing it? Because if it's not in the policy, there's an awful lot depending on the training and the temperament and the mindset of the person or people that are doing the collection development. So I would encourage you to consider actually having something like that in writing. And I would be curious, again, if you want to use the chat, or they can, if you're on the phone, unmute yourself and say if people have, if you're aware of this in your library, if your library policy, if your policy has anything about intentionally trying to get different voices into your collection. Then let's talk a little bit about behavior in the library. That can be a very controversial one, everything from kids being too loud after school, or roughhousing, or being too active, to issues with someone who might be using the library as a place to stay warm. It's where they, because they don't have anywhere else to go, or cool off in the summertime in the air conditioning. One example that often comes up with that one is issues around food in the library. If you allow students to come in after school and have a snack discreetly, in a neat way in the children's room, then you also need to let people eat elsewhere in the library. Or, if it's fine to have a covered cup of coffee while you're sitting and working at your laptop, what if somebody also comes in and starts to have a meal at your library because they don't have anywhere else warm to have a meal? So just thinking about, do you want to have a policy about that? And if so, how is it going to be enforced? And again, back to my friend and colleague's story about her son. What about sound in the library? Can people talk on their cell phone? Having rules around that, and thinking about making sure that whatever policy you decide to have around that is fair to everybody. So if it's okay for somebody to chat on their phone discreetly, then that means it's also okay for somebody to take a business call if they're using the library for their third space. If they're working for themselves and working from home, they come to the library to work. So that's one of those things where at first it might seem like it makes sense to not let people. Real reasons where you might want to allow it in a discreet way because it brings in populations that you might want, and you might want to make that message that you're welcoming those people. And then thinking about when people don't follow the rules and they are disruptive, how are you going to deal with that, and what's your policy about that? If you need help from another organization, what organization is that going to be? Is it going to be the police? Is it going to be a local mental health organization? Libraries are starting to have social workers in their libraries, which is probably not really an option for a lot of Vermont libraries because there just aren't probably enough people to go around to do that. But even like having an organization, a social work organization on sort of on call for you, so you know that you can reach out to them if you need them, rather than necessarily calling somebody and the police to come in for someone who's disrupting, not following the library policies, which might not actually technically be illegal depending on what they're doing, but it's disruptive. And just finding ways that you're not alienating people if you do have to deal with them in terms of how they might be not following your behavioral policies. At the end, again, you're going to have some links to articles about this that certainly can articulate it more deeply than I can. But there's a quote from one of the articles that I've put on the list is, as a general rule, if you have to think about whether or not you should call the cops, don't. And so, again, I mean, some of that is more in larger urban libraries. I don't know how much, the police get called in Vermont libraries, but I do know that it happens sometimes. And sometimes it's fine, and other times it's, does not end great. So then also thinking about in terms of legal implications, there can actually be legal implications depending on the person's status. If a person is not following the behavior because of a disability. They're a protected class, so just think about that. This slide is from a lawyer librarian who's worked a lot around issues like this, and these are the things that libraries should consider. And it makes a cute, convenient acronym, but the right of free speech, applying policies consistently. Oh, we hadn't talked about the transparency of policies, and that is another really important thing. Like, people cannot be expected to follow policies if they don't know what they are. So they should be on the website, clearly posted. There should be print versions of them available if someone asks. And then there should also be a policy for what happens if they are not following them. So sort of larger issues around, like, how can we get to where we want to be about this? How diverse is your staff? Like, if, we're not a terribly diverse staff, but is that a consideration when you hire people? And what about the board? The makeup of the board is an important thing because the board is making policies. So we have a great speaker coming up on Friday who's going to talk a lot about finding different board members and having different populations represented on the board. So she'll talk about that on Friday, but just consider that if you have a pretty homogeneous board and staff, that might be just the reality, but you can also try to work to expand that a little bit, and then also have resources where people can help you that aren't necessarily on your staff, but you could have your policies looked at by someone from a different population, predict who might be affected by this, and ask someone to read this. Like, you have, if you have a child like my colleague who has autism, could you read this and see if this is a policy that would welcome your child into the library? Think about your strategic plan, and have you considered equity and diversity inclusion issues in that, and how is it affected, and are you going to mention certain policies and trying to incorporate that? And again, you don't have to do this all on your own. There are trainers who can work with you on this. You can have people look at your policies and review them. And what other community organizations do you partner with in terms of programming, taking suggestions for collection development things? If you're always partnering, again, with sort of homogenous groups, then you're going to get less of a diverse policies, collection, programming. So again, just, you don't have to do this all on your own, but partnerships are a huge part of library, collaborations with other community organizations. So think about diversifying that where you do your partnerships. And then also even the budget. How is your budget allocated? Is equity and inclusion a consideration within that? And whether you're spending money on, taking part of your collection development money to dedicate to try to diversify your collection, or other ways that you could just think about how you're allocating your money. I'm going to open up for questions and look back on the chat in a second here, but I did also just this is another quote from one of the articles I'm sharing at the end, that balancing the needs of different patrons requires that libraries do their best to promote an atmosphere that's welcoming to all patrons and conducive to everyone's enjoyment of the library. So that is our end goal here. And just to reframe maybe how we're thinking about that, and when we say all patrons, who are those people that we're trying to include in that? So here is that'll be the link to the resources, and then we're going to have that on our website as well. But I want to now look at the comments here. And so if people have questions, comments, at this point, people can call in if they want, or unmute your mics and discuss. I'm just going to scroll back through here. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to kind of go back to the top here. There's some really interesting comments in here that, oh yeah, Almi mentions the libraries are for everyone. Posters, there's a wonderful company that makes graphics that are very, very inclusive and a great visual for expressing welcoming for everybody. And Callie makes a really good point here too, Asha, about libraries having no sleeping policies because they're concerned about an overdose. That's a good point that is something certainly to be careful about that I had not really thought of. So thank you for bringing that up. So you had a question. Isn't that the card not treating people fairly? And I'm not sure which, was that the easy access card? If you're still on the call. Okay, I'm not sure what she meant, but does anyone have, oh, is this Almi?
One, if you look in the chat.
Okay. Almi, can you just say it? I'm not finding it here quickly.
Oh, sure. Yes, I was referring to that was when you were talking about the Berkeley card, the easy access card. It still has barriers. So just playing the devil's advocate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I noticed that you have to have a picture ID of, I mean, some people don't even have that. But I think
it also limits people's access based on the fact that they don't have X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the real issue of if you're lending out physical materials, you need to have a way of getting them back. So, I think that's why that limitation is there. There are some libraries that just sort of take that in stride and think, that's the price of doing business, and occasionally you lose things. And I think, that could work depending on what the scale on which that happens. Again, that's probably something that's easier to do at a small library. So let's see. Right. Adrian points out some libraries charge for non-residents, and yes, but there's a reason for that. It's because the residents are actually paying the tax base that provides the library. So that's kind of a logical one. But one thing that I was thinking about along those lines too is that another thing that can make library services more equitable is collaboration. So if you, again, a budgetary issue, if you commit to things like joining the consortiums that are available in Vermont, joining the courier system, then you're going to be offering your communities a lot more things than you could do just if you're sort of trying to do it, again, all on your own, because obviously there's a pretty large disparity in Vermont libraries and what services they can offer because of the size of their budget and their staff and size of their building and everything. So that's actually collaboration, and consortial work can actually be an equity issue as well. Yeah, and Adrian makes a good distinction between the municipal libraries and the tax base. Yeah, it's different for nonprofit libraries, but they do typically get some appropriation from their taxpayers as well. Josh, did I miss any questions or comments in the chat that we haven't sort of looked back on?
Oh, Ron makes a comment about, I'll just read it actually. Our collection development policy does mandate a, quote, wide range of interests and viewpoints, but we need to clarify and strengthen this based on what you're presenting here. I think that's a good point.
Right, I think because sometimes it's the concept, we believe in the concept, but without sort of concrete things of like what the specifics are, again, it's just left to the training of the person doing it or the people doing it and their viewpoint and how much they try to do that. And it's a constant, collection development takes a lot of training and time, and some guidelines on it really helps. So Almi says sometimes a quandary to offer a program with materials fee, like a painting class, versus not offering it at all because it's not free. That's a really good point. I mean, like, I strongly believe that public library programs should all be free. And maybe that's a place where you could get the friends of the library if your library has a friends group, or get grant funding for that, or have a part of your programming budget that sometimes goes for that kind of thing, because you're definitely not providing equitable programming if a fee is involved. I know that some libraries will sometimes do, pass like a donation basket at the end to sort of offset pricing, and that's better than charging a fee up front, because then people who have the means and want to, and the generosity and want to help out can. But it's kind of a slippery slope too, because there's that kind of awkward feeling of like an obligation that you might feel if you're in that setting and people are giving money. And so, this is a really big topic, and it's certainly not one that we're going to figure out in 45 minutes. But I do encourage you to look at some of the resources on that list. Again, it's in here. That there's a link to it there, and it'll be on our website as well. There's some of the articles in there are sort of conceptual about why we need to think in this way. But some of them are more practical, and there's a couple of webinars that on that list that give training in just how to put this into practice, like if you're on board with the concept of it, but aren't really sure how to follow through on it. And then we at the department are definitely very committed to these ideas. We can help you if you have specific questions, help you with collection development ideas or publishers. So always reach out to us. And as Jason said in his talk, if we don't know the answer, we'll try to find it. And that's what we're there for. And we have, time and capacity to look for things that you may not have. So I do hope that you'll stay committed to this concept, try to learn more about it, and also really support your library staff in getting training in all kinds of training, but specifically training around this. It changes quickly. It's almost like technology in terms of like we're always getting new ideas about issues around equity and inclusion. So be sure that you're supporting your library staff getting training, so then they're able to do their work better in a more progressive way. So if anyone has anything else they want to add chat-wise or call in, certainly open to that. Give it like a minute or so, and if not, we'll sign off here and see you at the next session. But I'm just going to keep things open for a little bit. Asking for training for staff, and do you have recommendations? The Public Library Association has really great training on this. They, before the pandemic, and I hope that they will continue to do this again, they actually had symposiums that like 3-day sessions around this kind of thing that are really, really good if you're able to attend that. But they also have a lot of webinars related to this. They have a whole task force. It's called the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Social Justice Task Force, I think is the full name. And they have a lot of materials on their website. Trainings. The trainings aren't always free, but sometimes they do have free webinars. So that would be my first go-to place. And they are very committed to having, like that task force is, it's the makeup of it is people from a lot of different points of view and races and ethnicities and gender. And so they are, it's not people like that aren't in those populations telling other people what to do, is I guess is my point with that. And then there's also, within Vermont, the social justice, the Peace and Justice, I'm blanking on the name, but the Peace and Justice organization in Burlington, I can't think of what the name is right now, but they have trainings, and they will come out and I'm assuming they will do this again when we can do things in person again, but they will do trainings at libraries for staff, for patrons. Yes, thank you, Almi, Peace and Justice Center in Burlington. And I think, I'm not as aware sort of outside central Vermont and Chittenden County of the organizations, but I think that they do exist. There's the Fairness and Diversity Partnership for Fairness, Diversity in Brattleboro is another great resource. They have a good website, and they offer trainings as well. They typically have an annual sort of symposium that's a couple days long. So that's another one. I can write that actually in here. Thank you, Josh. Josh put the link for the Peace and Justice Center. Josh, if you could grab the link for the partnership, that would be great as well, and stick that in there, and then it'll be in the chat. And then after that, I think we will wrap up. But thank you, everybody, for coming. Please stay in touch throughout the week. Please attend many of the things. A lot of things, as I said, I touched on today, will be discussed with the board management training on Friday morning. So please keep that in mind, and hope to see you all at many future things this week. Thank you.